Following the recent standoff between Europe and the United States over Greenland, can the US-led international system survive?
The current or the old order, I believe, already has fallen apart. And what we're moving towards are what one could refer to as siloed economies. So the US standing in one part of the world, Russia standing in its part of the world, China standing in another. For Europe, the challenge is to actually become a geopolitical player in and of itself.
But is Europe ready to break away from its dependence on the United States?
The problem is you are no longer facing, I think, a rational, democratic leader in the United States. You are facing a bully who only understands the language of strengths. And this is where Europe has to learn a new language.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. In his first term in office, President Donald Trump floated the idea of buying Greenland, which has been part of the Kingdom of Denmark since the 18th century. Now, fast forward to 2026, there's been increased American interest in Greenland's strategic importance, with the Arctic's melting ice sheet opening up new sea routes and providing access to the region's resources. But President Trump argues the US needs to control Greenland for national security reasons to stave off potential threats from China and Russia. One of the countries that has been actively engaged in Arctic security is Latvia, a Baltic nation that shares a border with Russia. Krisjanis Karins served as Prime Minister of Latvia from 2019 to 2023. He joins us now from Riga. Mr. Karins, Latvia has been a member of the European Union and NATO since 2004. How critical is this moment for the Western Alliance, particularly for European nations? Is this a turning point?
I believe it is a turning point. Actually, the past year, the first year of Trump's second term is a big turning point, with the U.S. Turning away from its traditional role in the world as, say, the global policeman, the country that stands behind the rule of law. President Trump is moving the U.S. into a great power politics. I suppose that's the easiest way to explain it. And in the Baltics, what that means that our main security partner, which has been the U.S. since regaining independence in 1991, is now changing its role. And Europe is, unfortunately, in terms of security, not yet up to speed to replace the U.S. should the U.S. actually decide to move further away from Europe. So in this part of the world, it actually causes a lot of uneasiness.
But should European leaders have seen this coming? After all, international law and the rules of the so-called rules-based order have been trampled on for years. European leaders have remained silent. Some of them are now choosing to speak up. But is it too late now to stop Trump?
No, I don't believe it's too late, and I don't think in terms of stopping or not stopping the U.S. president. What the U.S. president is highlighting is that Europe needs to take care of itself, certainly in terms of security. So European leaders, I think for many years, had the, I hope it won't really happen mentality. And even during the past year, I think there's been a lot of internal denial. No, it can't really be happening. The reality
is it because it was happening to others? It was typically happening in the global south.
I suppose that's one explanation. Remember, in Europe, the architecture of security since the end of the Second World War has been explicitly the U.S. essentially backstopping all security and defense on the continent. And since the end of the Cold War, most, not all, but most European countries cut back massively on defense spending, which leaves them actually quite vulnerable and much more dependent on the US than even in the 1980s. So Europe was caught unprepared. There are many country internal reasons for this unpreparedness, and Europe is now in the transformational stage of trying to come to grips with it all. But events are transpiring much more quickly than European leaders are able to make decisions, because the architecture, how Europe decides, up to date has been through unanimity. This is going to be looked at, I'm quite certain.
Could this spell the end of NATO? And what happens to European defense if this is the beginning of the end of the North Atlantic Alliance?
No, I don't believe it's the end of NATO, of the North Atlantic Alliance, but it is certainly a major inflection point. U.S. presidents since Obama have been extolling European leaders to invest in their own security. It took Trump to actually make real threats that actually got leaders to agree to invest. And the transformation is that NATO, that is the European part of NATO, will be essentially funded by and taking care of European countries themselves. The challenge is Europe is not there yet, but there is a real and ongoing hot war right on the European Union's doorstep that is in Ukraine, coming into its fourth year.
Do you accept Trump's national security argument that he must have Greenland, whether quote unquote they like it or not, because Chinese and Russian ships are surrounding the island, because he says Moscow and Beijing may want to capture Greenland? Is this about national security? Is it about securing Greenland's resources? Or is it simply about Trump's own personal ego?
Well, there certainly seem to be a number of issues at play. Clearly, it's overstated and simply not true that there are Russian and Chinese warships prowling around the waters around Greenland as we speak. The Danish military has confirmed that this is not the case. But certainly, it is understandable that the U.S. is concerned about utilizing Greenland for the defense of the United States. The problem is that the U.S. already has a base in Greenland. During the Cold War, it had many more. The Danes have no objection to increasing a U.S. military presence on Greenland. And Denmark and other NATO allies have recently begun exercises in Greenland to highlight that European allies are equally interested and willing to up the ante in Greenlandic defense. But it seems that the real issue is not so much whether U.S. military could be deployed in Greenland to help bolster the defense also of the United States, but actually it seems to have more to do with when you read the Trump administration's new national security policy of putting their footprint much bigger in the Western Hemisphere.
Let me ask you from Latvia's perspective. You share a land border with Russia to the east. How concerned are you about the Arctic's security? Do you see Russia as the primary threat or the United States?
Well, I don't see the United States as a threat, but clearly Russia is interested in the Arctic and China as well. So in a sense, what President Trump is saying is very exaggerated, but in the general direction of where the threat is. The difference is how that threat is perceived in Europe, in the Baltics, and in the US, and what should be done about it. So Trump is saying the only solution is for the US to annex Greenland. That's the only way to secure it. And in Europe, European countries are saying, well, wait a minute. Actually, combined, the US and European forces can easily bolster Greenland's defenses and increase Arctic security for the entire North Atlantic Alliance. So it's a difference of approach. The US president is seemingly interested in physically expanding US territory, whereas the Europeans are, one, defending the sovereign rights of nations and the inviolability of national borders, and Greenland as part of the Kingdom of Denmark fits in that category, but at the same time completely willing, and I do believe it's important, to increase NATO's military presence also in the Arctic.
But when you consider Russia's vital interests, not only is it a major Arctic nation, but it also covers 53% of the Arctic. Is it natural for the Russians to also have their own vital national strategic interests in that region?
Well, of course, everyone has their vital strategic interests. The question is what any country is willing to do about it. And the concern is that the US, instead of working with its European NATO allies, currently seems to be working on this level against European NATO allies, which takes the eye off the ball. Because the real security concern for both the US and for Europe is Russia and growingly also China.
But Russia hasn't threatened to invade Greenland.
The question is not whether anyone is going to invade Greenland. The question is how Arctic security could be improved. And European countries, and there I think that that's right, say that the best way to do that is to continue cooperation with the US.
It sounds almost like continuing the appeasement policy that European leaders have also pursued with Trump. Clearly, and he has said this repeatedly, he respects power and force. He does not believe in international law. Is this a game changer for European leaders? Is it a wake-up call?
Yes, it is a wake-up call, and the mood in Europe is shifting from sort of laying low and hoping it'll blow over into accepting that there is a new reality and doing everything to become stronger. And the real question is, will Europe be able to invest and increase its military strength in time, or shall we say, fast enough so that Russia does not perceive Europe to be weak, as the US, potentially as a result of this crisis, could be turning even more further away from Europe.
But would you agree with those who believe that European leaders may have reaped what they sowed, that for too long they have tolerated, they have accepted Trump's abuses of power?
Well, European leaders, European countries, with a few exceptions, have underinvested in defense for more than 20 years. And in that sense, they are now reaping what they did not sow. So they have and Europe has a very large dependency on the US for security. And this is the lever that Trump knows that he has. And this is what European leaders also understand, knowing that Russia is continuing to fight a war, and Europe understands that that is a threat not only to Ukraine, of course, but to all of continental Europe. That is what has been up until now restraining them from standing up more firmly to the US. But as time goes on, as European investments in defense go up, and as Europe finds a way to overcome, shall we say, the structural difficulty of making rapid decisions, and that's simply due to the makeup of the European Union decision-making process there, Europe will become stronger and tougher with the US. And when it comes to pure size of economies, well, certainly when Europe is united in terms of trade and trade barriers and tariffs, the US can inflict damage on Europe, but Europe can do the same to the US.
But the question is, do they have the political will to use whatever tool they may have at their disposal? Because since 2023, the EU has had a so-called anti-coercion instrument known as the Big Bazooka. They've never used it, but it was designed to be used against countries like China or other nations that may bully or try to blackmail the European Union.
Well, I believe it would actually be in the interests of Europe and the United States to find a way to de-escalate, because they have both sides have much more in common in terms of interests than what divides them. This is a tremendous distraction, which is coming to the complete benefit of Putin's Russia. And is doing no one in Europe and no one in the US any good.
But again, now, it sounds like appeasement, Mr. Karins.
De-escalation and appeasement are two different things. It takes two sides to de-escalate, and it only takes one to appease. Europe tried the appeasement route. I suppose that's the best way to call it. That hadn't worked. So I would think that this time around, Europe will be more tough.
But is there the risk that this sort of appeasement, this sort of de-escalation could be read by Washington as weakness? How do you negotiate with a bully?
I'm not advocating appeasement. 80 years of looking at the US as a strategic, strong, reliable ally. In 1 year's time, this has changed. And it's taking European leaders time psychologically to adjust to that. But also, factually looking at the ground, in spite of Europeans' wishes, Europe still and currently does not have the defensive capabilities that the US has. And that's the conundrum in the entire equation. This is a situation that the Trump administration and President Trump seems to be exploiting which is extremely unfortunate. Ultimately, I believe unfortunate for the US as well.
Do you believe that European nations will eventually have to start looking east? We saw how Canada recently signed a major strategic agreement with Beijing. Is China in the long term going to be a much more reliable partner for Europe? And what do you make of Prime Minister Mark Carney talking about the need for a new global world order, saying the bargain no longer works, we are in the middle of a rupture? Do you see it this way?
Well, certainly the current or the old order, I believe, already has fallen apart. And what we're moving towards are what one could refer to as siloed economies. So the US standing in one part of the world, Russia standing in its part of the world, China standing in another. And for Europe, the question is not replace, shall we say, US as the main partner with China or someone else. But for Europe, the challenge is to actually become a geopolitical player in and of itself. With its 450 million inhabitants, if you include Great Britain, that's more than 500 million people. It is a huge trading bloc, one of the wealthiest parts of the world. If it pulls more closely together, in a sense, if Europe moves towards federalization, it could become one of the major powers in the world, which would be a rival to the US and a rival to China. And this is what I think Europe needs to consider, not throwing, shall we say, all the cards in any one direction, but understanding that Europe has a need and indeed has a capability to become one of the major powers in the world as well. But if the US is forcing this rupture, then the only alternative for Europe is to become strong in and of itself and to deal with China as a strong entity, and also then to deal with the US as a strong entity. This is in its early stages, but I believe this is the direction that Europe is going to attempt to go.
Krisjanis, Karins, former Prime Minister of Latvia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the current standoff between the US and Europe has exposed the growing cracks in the Western alliance, with some calling for the creation of a more autonomous European defense structure. But can Europe wean itself off its dependence on the United States? We're joined now by Fabrice Pothier, a former NATO Director of Planning Policy. Fabrice Pothier, European nations have relied on the United States for their collective defense for the past 80 years or so. Are they now beginning to reconsider their options? Are they starting to seriously think about a new framework that is not led by the United States, or do they continue to see the US as a reliable ally?
Well, clearly, I think this is a new brave world, as the Canadian Prime Minister has said, and also when it comes to NATO. And it's not about the military planning, it's not about the NATO headquarters, it's about this fundamental political trust between the allies, and especially between Europe and the US, that has been shattered with Donald Trump's threat of annexing Greenland. So I think this is where we are now.
If this is where we are, where does NATO go from here? Is this latest threatening behavior on the part of Donald Trump the last argument that NATO's European members needed to start seriously thinking about strategic autonomy?
Yes, probably you're right. I think that notion was already emerging earlier last year when Donald Trump took over and started to put enormous pressure on the European allies. But now I think they have come to this realization that the US is no longer a reliable ally. Now the question is, where do you go next? Do you Europeanize NATO? Do you accept that NATO becomes some form of zombie institution and build something in parallel? Or do you build something inside the European Union? And I think none of those scenarios are ideal and perfect, and all have, I think, pros and cons. But clearly, I think the European allies and European capitals are clearly now starting to think about what the alternatives look like.
But can you have a NATO without the United States? And can European nations make up for the United States' raw power?
It's interesting that there's been this talk of a post-transatlantic world and post-American European security, and yet I don't think anyone's got a clear answer to your question in the sense, what does it take to replace the United States from a capabilities, from a capacity point of view inside NATO? So I think we should start here with the European allies looking at what does it take to really build something that is credible and reliable enough for us to assure our own defense and security. For sure, it will take not only money, not only weapon systems and capabilities. It will take political unity, and I think we're still far from that. Because frankly, who are the natural leaders in Europe for European defense? Not France, not Germany alone, and not the United Kingdom, which is outside the EU. So I think there will have to be possibly a new collective leadership, and that's what might take more time.
Emmanuel Macron has long argued for more security independence from the United States. In fact, he pushed the idea of a true European army, saying that Europe cannot protect itself without it. Was he right? And is this something that could be developed?
Well, I think as often President Macron is right, but not necessarily France is not necessarily the one option. At least it's not the one leader that is accepted among all the European allies. So often, France is criticized for wanting to lead, but in fact wanting to get EU subsidies for its own defense industry. So I think you will have to create a new collective. It might be this coalition of the willing that France and the United Kingdom, together with Germany and the Nordic countries, have assembled to be able to deploy a reassurance force in a post-ceasefire Ukraine. Maybe this coalition of the willing could become the embryo to something more institutional and more structural.
But does all of this spell the end, or at least the beginning of the end, of NATO? The Prime Minister of Denmark said that Trump's threats to take control of Greenland would destroy the North Atlantic Alliance. Is she right?
I think we can accept that this is the beginning of the end of what NATO used to be, because fundamentally, this is not, as I mentioned, about how many weapons, how many soldiers you have. It's about this pact, this trust between the United States and Europe, that the US will be there as a reliable ally for European security and defense. And I think Donald Trump's statements and behavior have broken this trust. And I'm not sure it will take enough of a new president, a new US president, to restore trust. So I think now it is increasingly accepted that this notion that the US will be the main guarantor of European security, that's a notion that increasingly belongs to the past. The question is, how long will it take us to build that future proposition of a European security architecture built by Europeans?
Is there a sense that European leaders, certainly those among the NATO members, have been too willing to appease, flatter, and go along with Donald Trump?
I mean, clearly the natural instinct of our democratically elected leaders is to seek dialogue and to try to de-escalate situations. The problem is you are no longer facing, I think, a rational, democratic leader in the United States. You are facing a bully who only understands the language of strengths, similar to Putin and other autocrats. And this is where Europe has to learn a new language, the language of power and strengths. And this is not something we are comfortable with, and not just in military terms, but also in economic terms, even though we have many instruments to exert some form of pressure or counter pressure on the US, and yet we are reluctant to use it. So I think we have to accept that we do have to learn this new language if we want to protect our own interests.
Your former boss, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, said recently that Trump is, quote, a threat to world peace, and that the time for flattery is over. Are NATO members, though, ready to stand up to Trump?
Well, I don't think all the NATO members are ready. And that's the question, is whether there will be some form of consensus and unity across Europe to agree on the fact that we need to build strengths, and then to agree on how we're going to build these new strengths. But clearly, this is a question of survival. Because if Europe doesn't get its act together, we're going to end up being the colony or the sphere of influence of various autocratic or increasingly less democratic powers, ranging from the United States, China, and Russia. And if we want to be able to stand on our feet, we'll have to be accepting a higher degree of strengths and to be deploying these strengths.
Fabrice Pothier, former NATO Director of Policy Planning.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The crisis over Greenland has stripped the rules-based order of its last illusions. What the Global South has long endured, US impunity, selective legality, and repeated violations of international law, has only become intolerable now that the threat is felt in Europe. For European nations, this is the real test. Will the continent finally stand firm, and can NATO members imagine their collective security without unquestioned dependence on Washington? For much of the world, the answer may lie elsewhere, in seizing this moment to move beyond a US-led global order that promised rules but delivered power without restraint or accountability. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team. Thanks for watching.